Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 69. I am the show's host, Kyle. Today's show, I'm going to spend a lot of time on the situation in Syria. There's been a lot of big developments in Syria recently, and I think setting the stage for everyone, kind of just letting everybody know where all the chess pieces are moving around at this time would be very helpful, so that's going to be most of today's show. If you are interested in this and you want other people to also get some knowledge on this and be interested in it, I suggest you share the show. The easiest way to do that is going to my Facebook page, Kyle's Files, and clicking the share button from there, or going to the website for the podcast, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, and clicking the share button from there. Either way, it will help the show to grow, and this is working. Every episode is doing better than the last, more downloads, more listens, so I'm really excited about this, and it's because people are sharing the show. So if you can take the 1 or 2 minutes it would take you to do that, I would really appreciate it and would help to get some more knowledge out there on foreign policy. So let's get into the news. First thing I want to start with is the Pentagon is spending $2.3 million on rent at Trump Tower in New York City. The Pentagon rented out this area of Trump Tower to use, I guess, as some sort of military outpost should Trump be living at Trump Tower for any period of time. I don't know if they're concerned about Melania kicking him out of the White House or him vacationing there, but I guess they feel they need this, military base set up here in Trump Tower, and I guess to respond to any maybe critical news if, Trump's sleeping in his bed in New York at Christmas and some big thing happens in Syria, maybe he needs to be able to run downstairs and make a decision on something. I'm not sure, but it seems like an awful lot of money. And this is one of the unique costs of electing Donald Trump as president. Maybe, Hillary Clinton has this thing, then they end up renting out her neighbor's house or something, and it costs just as much money, but still another just hidden cost of the war budget, another $2.4 million American dollars down the drain on a useless military post. Of course, this money could be left in the pockets of the hardworking Americans who earned it and, generate wealth in the economy that way, or at least given to poor people who are really struggling and not renting the space from Donald Trump. Also, just want to mention, I really don't see a conflict of interest here necessarily. I think it's just kind of one of the things that comes along with having Donald Trump as the president. I'm sure the military feels they absolutely need to have posts at this location, and that's why it's there. And it's not that, Trump is looking to skim an extra $2 million off the top from the U.S. government. He's not taking any pay or anything like that, so I don't think that the presidential venture is about making money, at least from this kind of just small dollar cronyism way. He's the president of the United States. Paul Ryan unilaterally removed the amendment that Barbara Lee had placed on the 2008-18 NDAA. That amendment would have repealed the 2001 authorization of use of military force that the United States has used to justify going to war with several countries around the world, even though that particular AUMF was supposed to be limited to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I saw a story about Russia, a Russian military official saying that Russia plans to build military bases in Yemen, Libya, and Syria. First thing, like always, is just to remember that Russia has its own internal politics, just like the United States, and when top U.S. generals or U.S. politicians come out and say that the U.S. is gonna do something overseas, it doesn't always mean it means it's gonna happen, but if it does happen, I think it could prove problematic. In Libya, the Russian government bats Haftar, and then if they put a base into Libya, it's going to incentivize them to make sure that Haftar stays in power, which could become a problem if the United States really wants to push their government, which is a opposing government to General Haftar. In Yemen, I couldn't find out who Russia prefers there, and if this is the Yemeni government two-timing America and Saudi Arabia and letting Russia put a base there, or if this is the Houthis making an agreement to put a base in Yemen. I am not sure. There's already a Russian base in Syria, but again, this is gonna make Russia want more for the Syrian government with Bashar al-Assad to stay in power there. The more bases they have, the more they have to lose. Iran is also looking at building a base in Syria. And I read a report from the Syrian state military saying that Syria has approved Iran to build a base in Syria. From Assad's perspective, these are probably smart moves. It's going to allow Assad to have a little bit more stability and backing from Iran and Russia with their military bases there. They'll have more to lose if Assad falls. So I think this is the potential downside to Russia building these military bases. It's not a good cause for peace. That being said, just to put in perspective, America has troops in 177 different countries. So I don't want to come off as, just, attacking Russia for absolutely no reason. Russia absolutely has an incentive to build these military bases to match the massive number of military bases that the United States has built themselves. Another thing that gives Russia a lot of cause for the concern is that NATO is beginning another set of war games from the Baltic to the Black Sea involving about 30,000 troops and then various missiles and planes and tanks and other military weapons, especially I think there's a lot of naval stuff going on in these particular war games. Of course, Russia always sees this as a threat since they're simulating a war with Russia. Russia does respond by this. They're having, every 4 years, Russia has major war games in the west of their country where they look to simulate an invasion of Eastern Europe, and so, this story does play out on both sides. However, I believe NATO is doing a total of 36 different war games this year. NATO member France has a change as their armed forces minister resigned after the French president wanted to cut about $800 million out of their military budget. Most interesting thing about this is that France is quibbling over $8 million in their military budget, and the U.S.'s military budget is going to be $1 trillion in 2018, and so we're talking about less than 1% of the American military budget that France is having their armed forces minister quit because of, but it seems like he also has some philosophical difference with the president, and they exchanged some words on the way out, and it was a whole show, so if anybody's interested in some French politics, you look more into that story. At the UN, Nikki Haley criticized African countries for failing to respond to the famine that is going to affect 14 million people across 3 African countries. Of course, there's also food instability in other regions around Africa, and Ethiopia is nearing the end of their food aid they receive on the international scale, putting an additional 7 million Ethiopians at risk of starving. This story really upset me. I think more than most. This is Nikki Haley, somebody, at the UN, an ambassador of America who has meddled in the Middle East and Africa, America who's armed warlords and dictators and, paid terrible people to do terrible things to people. We've invaded, we've bombed, and we've had heavy influence in Africa. And if there's one thing, if you look at the continent of Africa and say, it's, that American interventionism hasn't made anybody safer, wealthier, or happier. And if anything, American, especially military interventionism, has only ended up in as being very negative for the people of Africa. And then so for Nikki Haley to come out and criticize the people of Africa is just despicable. I think for probably, as seen from the people of Africa, this has to be kind of Nikki Haley spitting in their face. Of course, I guess I could say that the African community should come together and they should try to do whatever they can to feed their own, starving people. And I'm not sure if it's possible for the African countries to undertake this task on their own alone, but it does seem like, they probably could be doing a little bit more. That being said, the person that should be criticizing Africa definitely should not be Nikki Haley, who's representing the country that caused a lot of the problems that Africans face today. Of course, this is the most obvious examples are South Sudan, where there's a few million starving people, and Somalia, where there's another few million starving people, where American intervention, and in the case of South Sudan, oil interests created a new country, breaking Sudan in two and leading to potential genocide in South Sudan. You right now have ethnic war raging in South Sudan where the government forces are of one ethnic group and they're attacking rebel forces of another ethnic group, and they kill civilians along the way. There's millions of civilians trying to flee right now. I think most recently the government was marching towards a town and up to 5,000 people are running away from that town because they know they'll get slaughtered by the South Sudanese government soldiers. And of course the state of South Sudan was largely created by Hillary Clinton and the Barack Obama State Department. In Somalia, Somalia under George W. Bush. George Bush created the possibility to first form a group like Al-Shabaab, but then killed off all the other groups that could compete against Al-Shabaab, leaving the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab group as holding, at one point, over half of Somalia, and now it's like maybe up to a third of the landmass. And so I guess Nikki Haley either just doesn't have a memory or doesn't have a heart and could come out and criticize the people of Africa like this. Is unbelievable. Last story before I get into the Syrian stuff, we have U.S. workers, military personnel being at a military base and using a military base that the African country of Cameroon uses to imprison and then torture soldiers. It doesn't say that any Americans were involved in the torture, but it seems they did know about the torture. Prisoners interviewed said that they heard and saw Americans there. Alright, moving on to Syria. I'm going to update this situation in Syria. I really want to set the stage, and hopefully we could get some people interested in Syria. I think if enough U.S. citizens become interested in Syria, then there is a chance that we could at least minimize U.S. involvement in Syria. I mean, right now what the United States is doing in Syria is only helping Al-Qaeda and ISIS-linked groups, and is not, looking to move to any sort of stable situation that could be good for the Syrian people. It's possible that this civil war could go on for years and years to come, and so I'm going to call this episode Syria, the real Game of Thrones, and I think as I go through and detail all the different players and then all the different fronts and all the different alliances that these players have, you'll see that the situation in Syria is much more crazy than what happened, especially in Sunday's episode of Game of Thrones. So the first group I'll talk about is the Syrian Arab Army. This is the Syrian government's army, the one that helps Assad. This army is backed by Hezbollah, Iran, and then various Shia militia groups who, I guess, have varying support from the Iranian government. The SAA has, the Syrian Arab Army, short SAA, has suffered a ton of losses in the battle. I think they have well over 100,000 casualties now. Hezbollah and Iran have been fighting for Bashar al-Assad since early in the war and have really done a lot to combat ISIS and then the Al-Qaeda linked groups. They seem to mostly focus on Syrian rebel groups and ISIS. There's no direct maybe alliance between Assad and the YPG Turkish groups, but there does seem to be no current fronts right now in Syria where those two groups are matched up against each other, and they seem to have a general feeling of, they'll need more enemies. Syria is backed by Russia, and Russia provides support either from missiles, through bombings, through troops, and then providing some weapons on the ground. Russia also provides the Syrian Arab Army with ground-to-air missile defense systems. I think they have S-300 systems in Syria. A lot of these ground-to-air missiles are manned by Russian troops. This is one of the reasons why the U.S. no-fly zone is kind of impractical, because the no-fly zone would involve blowing up these S-300 missile systems and then probably killing American or Russian soldiers. The Russians' main targets, like the Syrian Arab Army, seem to be the Syrian rebels, especially the jihadist Syrian rebels, the rebels located around Damascus, and ISIS throughout the country. Russia and the United States seem to bomb in different areas of the country, and I don't often see cases where it seems like the planes could possibly overlap. I think Russia has some more formal agreements with the YPG and Kurdish forces in Syria than the Syrian Arab Army does itself. Next, we have the United States and then the U.S. coalition. This coalition includes tons of member states, all the NATO member states, and then NATO itself. Of course, most of the bombs are actually dropped by the United States, with some small amount of bombs being dropped by the UK, I think Australia, and Canada. Most of the coalition airstrikes target ISIS forces or Assad forces, Shia militia forces. This, of course, was the case several times in the South Syrian desert and then the airfield where Trump targeted Assad's airfield. The U.S. seems to have backed off of this stance a little bit, and there's no really current fronts right now between the Syrian Arab Army and the U.S. coalition. Turkey and Turkish-backed rebels are part of a Turkish operation known as Euphrates Shield, and there's while that official military operation ended, the forces are referred to as Euphrates Shield. The Turkish-backed rebels are formerly part of Syrian rebel groups, Free Syrian Army rebel groups. They tend to fight in the north of Syria along the border with Turkey, especially right now against the Kurds, where it looked like they were lining up to run a mission against the Kurds in Afrin. You have ISIS, who I don't need a lot of explanation of ISIS, but of course they formed as a breakaway group from Al-Qaeda in Al-Nusra, which was Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. ISIS was formerly Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This group, unlike Al-Qaeda, felt they needed to immediately form a caliphate and started to do that, with it gaining its maximum power in 2014 with Baghdadi's declaration of the caliphate at the Al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul. Since then, ISIS has lost several major cities in both Syria and Iraq, most recently Mosul, and they're in the process of losing Raqqa right now. The mission of ISIS was to apparently form and hold a caliphate and take on all enemies, including Al-Qaeda-linked groups. You have the Al-Qaeda-linked rebel groups, and these are three pretty distinct different rebel groups. The first is HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I'll refer to it only as ATS from now on. That group is made up of the most hardline rebels. You also have Ahrar al-Sham, who is made up of a seemingly less hardline jihadists. I would say that all these groups are at least have some Al-Qaeda-linked factions within them and are often combinations of different small militias, with the third of these groups being the Free Syrian Army. HTS seems to be the most jihadist group and the one most committed to the philosophy of Wahhabi Islam. Ahrar al-Sham seems to be maybe less jihadist than HTS and be more Syrian nationals than HTS, and then the Free Syrian Army seems to be the least extreme of all these groups. Typically, these were the groups that received support from either the United States, Saudi Arabia, or any of our other Gulf allies. They were at times just kind of shell corporations that claimed to be non-serious jihadist rebels and then would just filter weapons to the more serious jihadist rebel groups, or they were very weak and had their Western weapons taken away from them by the more extreme groups. As far as I could tell, there's not a whole lot left of the Free Syrian Army, and most of the rebels fall into the first two groups. These groups do fight against each other. There's U.S.-backed rebel groups, more formally backed rebel groups than the Free Syrian Army. Some of these groups are located in the south of Syria, especially training across the border in Jordan. The most notable, really, story involving these militias has been their involvement at the garrison at Al-Tanf, where they've been training with the U.S. soldiers there, and U.S. soldiers have been carrying out airstrikes against the Syrian Arab army approaching Al-Tanf and trying to take ground in the Syrian desert there. These are also the rebel groups that were being trained by the United States when 3 U.S. Special Forces officers were killed by a Jordanian. You also have the United States-backed YPG and SDF forces. These groups are Kurdish mostly. The YPG is a Kurdish fighting force, with the SDF being a combination fighting force of the YPG and other Arab militias. I believe the majority of the non-YPG SDF fighters are Yazidis, and then the rest just being various Arab factions, but the backbone of the SDF is the YPG. The YPG is what allows the SDF to be successful and is really leading the fight in Raqqa, and so a lot of people just refer to the SDF as the YPG, and I tend to do that from time to time as well. And then you have other players who take maybe a lesser role, especially right now, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, who have provided weapons to Syrian rebel groups. Alright, now let's talk about all the different battlefronts in Syria. We're going to start with Raqqa, which is probably the one most in the U.S. mainstream press right now, where you have the YPG and its U.S. allies fighting ISIS. It does seem that while the advance of the YPG has slowed, that they are continuing to take small amounts of territory from ISIS. Although a U.S. military official did say that the YPG is taking heavy casualties in Raqqa. I did see a story where the YPG released the names and pictures of 12 YPG fighters who have been killed. This doesn't seem to be heavy to me if only 12 fighters had died, but the YPG does have an incentive not to play up the number of deaths. Of course, the YPG claims that al-Baghdadi is hiding out in Raqqa, and while this is so far unconfirmed to be true, it may incentivize the U.S. to fight a little bit harder in Raqqa. There is some concern about the ability for the Kurds to sustain this military mission while at the same time to fight against the Kurds or the Turks and the Turkish-backed rebels in northern Syria. South of Raqqa, but still in the Raqqa province of Syria, you have the Syrian Arab Army taking ground from ISIS, a lot of times relying on heavy airstrikes. Like U.S. airstrikes in Syria, these airstrikes are usually heavy on civilian casualties and maybe taking out 1 or 2 ISIS members per hour. Who knows how many civilians killed. Russia also supports the Syrian Arab Army with airstrikes in this region. This is, of course, the region where you did have a conflict where a U.S. plane shot down a Syrian. Right now in the South Syrian desert, we have a ceasefire, but it was no more than a month ago when you had this looking like the maybe flashpoint between a war against Russia and the United States. For a few weeks, the U.S. had a plan to stop the advance of Syrian Arab Army and allied troops trying to take ground from ISIS in the South Syrian desert. The U.S. did that by carrying out airstrikes against these groups and then saying they were trying to protect U.S. soldiers garrisoned at Al-Tanf. With the ceasefire, it does seem that things have cooled off in this region. This is, of course, the ceasefire that was agreed upon at the meeting with Trump and Putin. Moving up to the north of Syria, you have the Afrin area, which is controlled by the YPG Kurds. This is an area that's cut off from the rest of the Kurdish-held territory in Syria. It's an enclave, and it kind of sits on the Turkish border. Turkey looked like they were preparing with their rebels to attack the YPG in this area. However, these forces may have relocated to the Idlib province to fight against HTS. There has been some fighting between the Turkish rebels and the YPG. The Turkish government supported the advance of the Turkish rebels with artillery strikes. In the Idlib province, we have HTS fighting against Ashar al-Sham and various other rebel groups. It does seem that HTS is taking more ground than they're losing. There's unconfirmed reports of them taking a key border crossing with Turkey, as well as taking several other towns from Arar al-Sham. Other places, though, the Free Syrian Army apparently took one village from HTS, and then Ashar al-Sham took a couple villages from HTS as well, so it's not clear across the board that they're winning. Of course, there are major players in this battle taking sides. The group Al-Zinki, which became kind of a more mainstream name whenever they were the group that was there's this 8-year-old boy riding in the bed of a flatbed truck with a bunch of Syrian rebels. This absolute monster is stroking this child's head and kind of, playing with him and being nice, and then cuts the kid's head off like it's nothing. And so they have switched sides from ATF to Arar al-Sham. We also have various rebel groups. I think this includes HTS, Arar al-Sham, and the SDF fighting ISIS in this region, although I don't think there's any active fighting going on against ISIS. Around the capital city of Damascus, which is in the east of Syria, we have the SAA attacking various rebel groups and taking some territory from them. The SAA is looking to move on a key rebel stronghold city, and actually 28 Syrian Arab Army soldiers were just killed in an ambush moving towards that city. It does seem that the Syrian Arab Army is winning in this area, using one of two tactics. The first is to besiege the city and then move in and take the city. I do think that the SAA's most powerful force, the Tiger Force, has moved out towards Deir ez-Zor and is no longer fighting around Damascus. And then the second strategy used by Assad is to just besiege the cities and then form an agreement with the rebels where all the rebels and the civilians move up into the Idlib province. This has actually created quite a large population base for some of these Syrian rebel groups, and I think it's given them some legitimacy to kind of actually set up a sustainable government. I was talking to somebody who has a lot of information on this, and that they were saying even if there is some decrease in the amount of aid that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are sending to these Syrian rebel groups because of the split between the two countries, HTS has enough of a foothold in the area to be able to, just kind of maintain on their own. I would imagine that part of this is due to the large number of civilians sympathetic to the rebel cause that Assad has sent to the Idlib province with rebel fighters. Near the Golan Heights, which of course is the Syrian border with Israel, you have the Syrian Arab Army taking on rebel fighters. We have occasionally Israel attacking the Syrian Arab Army whenever mortar fire strays into the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is Syrian territory that has been occupied by Israel since I believe the 1967 war there, and Israel has a military base up there, so they will return fire if mortar fire strays into the Golan. I have heard that sometimes the rebels will fire mortar fire over there, and then Israel ends up attacking the Syrian Arab Army anyways. We also had Netanyahu saying that he has attacked Syria, the Syrian Arab Army, and Hezbollah a few dozen times. This is kind of the first official admission from Israel that they are bombing in Syria. Jumping back across the country now to the country's northeast, we have clashes on the Turkish border, which is borders Kurdish territory held by the YPG. Turkey has carried out, I believe, some airstrikes against the YPG in this area, claiming they were PKK, which of course is a rebel group within Turkey, also a Kurdish rebel group within Turkey, who is at least allied with the YPG if they don't share some more ties than that. The U.S. has put special operation forces really right in the middle of Turkey and the YPG here in hopes that will keep the two sides from attacking each other, mostly Turkey aggressing against the YPG. Moving more towards the center of Syria, we have the city of Deir ez-Zor, which is one of the last big cities that kind of is held by ISIS. Although the Syrian government does control a small portion of that city. There we have the Syrian Arab Army with a lot of support from Russia fighting against ISIS. A few months ago, it did seem like ISIS was advancing on the Syrian Arab Army there, but now it seems the tables have turned. In the center of Syria, we have the Syrian Arab Army continuing to carry out airstrikes with the Russian government against ISIS and take grounds from ISIS there. It looks that they're moving kind of south of Raqqa and towards Deir ez-Zor there. That may cut off some advancement of Kurdish forces towards the south of Syria and allow the Syrian Arab Army to reach Deir ez-Zor and be able to help the Syrian army that's inside the city. And then you have the United States and Russia carrying out airstrikes against various either Al-Qaeda linked or ISIS groups. I think Russia mostly bombs Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the United States pretty much only bombs ISIS. There has been some talks of the Russia and the U.S. working a little bit more together in Syria, but I don't know if that's going to happen. And that's really why I, kind of compare it to the Game of Thrones. There's so many different players with so many different interests. Every different group has a slightly different interest, even within the group of the rebel groups are the agreement between Iran, Hezbollah, and the Syrian Arab Army on how much of Syria they want to keep and take and what's going to be the ultimate outcome here. I think it is 100% in the air, and nobody can really know what's going to happen. There's so much more, powerful weapons always coming in. Of course, I mean, this leads all the way up to Russia and the United States both having H-bombs they could use. There's ballistic missiles, there's MOABs, there's larger bombs, there's more bombs. There's the entire U.S. and Russian military that could get involved here. And so even if it seems like with all the current pieces on the table that the Syrian Arab Army will one day control most of Syria, maybe other than Kurdish territory in the Idlib province, that doesn't necessarily mean that, by Russia or the United States flooding more weapons, and it can't go the other way. Maybe Assad gets a lot stronger and attacks the Kurds. Maybe the U.S. starts arming the rebel forces even more. Although Trump did just announce that he was ending the CIA program to arm Syrian rebels. Of course, this is met with John McCain and Lindsey Graham both going, oh my God, he's letting Assad win. Of course, all Trump's doing is not arming Al-Qaeda, and these two men are upset. It's so ridiculous. But yeah, I think that was a positive move. I'm looking forward to maybe some resolution to the Syrian conflict coming about. We did have some positive steps between Trump and Putin, and the last round of peace talks apparently went well. So maybe we're going to see some sort of solution or outcome to this. But when you have so many different groups with so many different ambitions, with so many different weapons and other things that they could pour into this situation to really change the tides of the war, I don't know if a resolution can come about, at least not anytime soon. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up the show today. I hope everybody enjoyed it. If you did, please share the show, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, I don't know, whatever you got. I don't do the Instagram thing, but I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE and at Facebook at Kyle's Files. There's also the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. My personal website is kylesfilesblog.com. I do a news roundup every day that goes up at the Libertarian Institute and also at my website. The website for the podcast is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And I think that takes care of all my plugs. I'll be back next week. I hope everybody has a good weekend, and hopefully we'll have some good news on these wars.